if you're, I'll put it in the chat also. I'll put it in the chat. Can you hear us now? All right. Could one of the other co-hosts, if you see Rabbi Young, that would be RDY. I don't see him. If you see him, would you make him a co-host, please?
David, Rabbi Young, speak up.
Hey, I'm over here. Hello, all.
Hi, Rabbi Young.
Hello, Rabbi Cohen.
Here you are. I found you.
I am found.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Rabbi Rosenfeld, shall we begin?
Anytime you're ready. Let me just remute everybody just to be sure. And unmute you and unmute Rabbi Weiss. Hold on. Did that work? Oh, come on.
I'm good.
Okay, good.
All right, well, wow. I left for a minute and we went from 85 to almost 125. Good evening, late good afternoon for all of you. I'm Rabbi Alan Litwack. I'm going to introduce all the colleagues that you are thankful for putting this on and introduce our guests. Let me give you a little bit of context in where this program is coming from. That is that for the past 15 years, there have been a group of rabbinic colleagues who have quietly gathered in the winter in South Florida. I'm only going to give you one guess as to why we choose South Florida in the winter. You can put that in the chat if you'd like, if you want to guess on that. We spend time, we spend about 4 days together sharing what it means to be men, to be husbands, to be rabbis. We spend our retreat time studying, schmoozing. We are a group that celebrates each other's triumphs and trials. We have colleagues who have been in the rabbinate for 8, 9 years, all the way to 39 years. What is wonderful about this group is that there really is no ego. We come together and we support each other and we work together. If you love your rabbi and you think he's the best rabbi ever, the reason for that is because of this group, or at least a part of it. So the In coming together and working together, we have created this Scholars in Their Residence project, and with the help of technology and the help of some really amazing scholars in the Reform movement, we're bringing this to you. I want to acknowledge my colleagues very quickly. I don't remember everybody's congregation, but I will tell you where the colleagues' names and where they're from, and you can do a silent one of these for your rabbi. So in alphabetical order, no other order than that, I want to say thank you to Rabbi Matt Cohen, who happens to be right across from me in the group in Galveston, Texas, Rabbi Frank DeWaskin in Cooper City, Florida, Rabbi Neil Hirsch in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, Rabbi Larry Mallinger in Aberdeen, New Jersey, Rabbi Brian Michelson in Reading, Pennsylvania, Rabbi Jordan Milstein in Bergen County, New Jersey, Rabbi Howie Needleman in Plantation, Florida, Rabbi, my assistant who is hosting this, Rabbi Harry Rosenfeld, extra thank you to him, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Rabbi David Spinrad in Alexandria, Virginia, Rabbi Michael Summer in Chicago, Illinois, and Rabbi David Young in Irvine, California. So literally, the marketing person who put this together had to put together supplies for everybody's in everybody's time zone. And we're delighted that you're all here with us. You're not here to listen to me, you're here to learn from our colleague and our teacher, Rabbi Dr. Andrea Weiss. Dr. Weiss is the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Provost at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. And I really should, let me just stop and just say, I want to acknowledge another colleague, Rabbi Steve Kay, who brings this group together and makes this happen, so he gets credit. But Rabbi Dr. Weiss is the provost of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. She serves as associate professor of Bible at the Hebrew Union College New York campus. She was ordained, like all of us, at HUCJIR, and she received her doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania. She is quite prolific in her writing. She was the associate editor of the Torah, the Women's Commentary, that was produced by the Union for Reform Judaism now, hard to believe, about a dozen years ago. She also most recently put together a book, and I hope you will go and find it. It's really a wonderful volume called American Values, Religious Voices, 100 Days, 100 Letters, where she invited individuals across the religious spectrum to share letters with the, at that point, incoming administration, Trump administration. So we're delighted that Dr. Weiss is here to teach us. I hope you'll discover what we already have discovered, and that is she's an amazing teacher. Take it away.
Thank you. Really nice to see everyone from literally across the country. I'm going to share my screen. And we'll use so when Rabbi Litwack asked me to be part of this program, I would have said yes, and sort of to anything, out of gratitude for Rabbi Litwack, who serves on the board of governors of the Hebrew Union College, and we've had a chance to get to know each other there. I love the title of the series. So I was hooked on that. And then when I found out more about the group, it really meant a lot to me to be able to study with. I have classmates from my rabbinical school class, former students, colleagues, and it's really nice to be together and study. And Rabbi Litwack asked me, it was already a couple weeks ago, and I was working on a new lesson in preparation for Shavuot that I was going to team teach with my colleague Lisa Grant. And it's customary on the Book of Ruth on Shavuot to read the Book of Ruth, and so it's always economical when you can prepare a lesson and have a chance to teach it a couple times. I thought I'd sort of redo it in a different way, and that you would be the beneficiary of having me be the second time of teaching this material. Well, it turned out on Shavuot, we were part of a tikkun that was sort of a series of classes coming out of Jerusalem, and the person before us was Zoom bombed by an anti-Semite. So we never actually taught the lesson. So this is you're getting this lesson. I redid it, but this is for the first time. And the reason I thought it was fitting, not only to be economical in my preparation, but the core idea we're going to talk about is this word chesed. And that just seemed, given the moment where we're at now, and this was already a couple weeks ago before we were planning it, when we only then had the pandemic that was on our mind, and now as racial injustice and this unrest that we're seeing in so many of our cities, this just seems all the more a fitting topic for us to explore today. So what we're going to do, we'll talk. I'll talk about this word chesed in a minute as it appears throughout the Bible. Then we'll focus it on the Book of Ruth, and then we'll see if we have time to look at some of how this idea plays out in some of the letters, and that's a project that Rabbi Litwack mentioned. And I'll maybe Alan, if you could kind of be monitoring and sort of just if there are questions in the chat, if people have them, I'll sort of pause, but if you can be the chat monitor, that would be.
Rabbi Rosenfeld is in charge of monitoring.
Even better. Okay.
Looks better.
A little bit about the Book of Ruth. And so the Book of Ruth is a small book. It appears in the third section of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, known as Ketuvim, or the writings. And you can see the way that it begins in its very first book, Vayhi bimei Shafot HaShoftim. So it was the day that the judges ruled. So this refers to the time, the system of local leaders like Deborah and other judges who ruled the land before there were our kings. So before Saul, before David, before Solomon, and part of and so there was sort of more local rule at that time. That's the literary setting. Scholars largely agree that the book was it's a later book from about the 5th century post-exilic, the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. In some ways, it deals with some of the issues that are very contemporary for us. How do we treat the foreigner? We'll see that's a big theme in the book. So in Israeli excellent new translation and commentary on the Hebrew Bible, or it's new in that it's all together in one volume. Robert Alter, his new Bible translation, the Hebrew Bible, he describes the Book of Ruth this way. He writes, "In the harmonious world of the Book of Ruth, the characters express a kind of moral confidence, ultimately stemming from a sense of the rightness of the traditional values of loyalty, love, and charity, and of the sustaining force of providence, even in the face of adversity." So if you look at those three words, loyalty, love, and charity, there's one Hebrew word that captures all of that, and that's the word chesed. And that's the word that we'll take a look at tonight. So I want to bring the first group of texts where we see that the one thing that these first group of texts all have in common is that we're going to see that chesed is a defining feature of God, that this is a characteristic, and many biblical texts praise God for God's chesed. So you'll see our Alter translates chesed most often as kindness, but it's actually a pretty hard word to actually translate. So let's take a look at it in a text that you may be familiar, you likely will be familiar with, whether you know it from its biblical context or you may recognize this from the High Holiday Liturgy. This is the passage from Exodus 34, 6-7, known as the 13 attributes. And we read it both on the High Holidays and other festivals. This occurs after the story of the golden calf. And this gives us a sense of God's quality. So here we read that God passed before Moses and called out, and God called out, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'Chanun, Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed v'Emet, Notzer Chesed la'alafim. And it goes on from there. So if we kind of unpack this, this is really the kind of distillation of God in a few words. So repeating God's name twice. So Rachum, the word for compassion, Chanun, graciousness or kindness. The phrase Erech Apayim, you can see here, it says slow to anger, but if we were to look at this more literally, it would be long-faced. And the if you can kind of think of a cartoon of a person who's really angry and has steam coming out of their nose, that the nose is often used as a source of anger. So here it's Erech Apayim, sort of long to get angry, slow to get angry. And then in contrast, though, but Rav Chesed, so abounding in this word Chesed. And I want you to see how Chesed is paired with the word Emet, truth, which or faithfulness. And then here, keeping Chesed for so the first part of the next verse 7 is sort of the good news. The good news is that God keeps God's Chesed for the thousandth generation. That's though only for those who do the right thing. But on the other hand, is going to carry the here in sense, bearing the crime, trespass, offense, and not acquitting those into the third or fourth generation of those who commit wrongdoing. So the good news, if people are all good, the chesed can extend for thousand generations. But if people do wrong, that's what we call transgenerational punishment, and that goes on to the third or fourth generation. This is a concept that we find in the Decalogue as well. We could do a whole other session just on this idea and how it changes in the Bible. And interestingly enough, the latter part of verse 7 is not what we incorporate in the liturgy. In the liturgy, we just keep the good stuff: God's Chesed, God's Emet, Rachamim, Chanun. So that gives us a key picture, and we can see here Chesed is repeated twice. Another passage that gives us a sense of what Chesed is all about comes from the book of Deuteronomy. And here we have a sense of God's love as the reasons for all the laws that we find in the book of Deuteronomy. And here sort of reminding us again, V'yadata, and you shall know, Ki Adonai Elohecha, Hu HaElohim. So this is sort of what God's all about. And Ha'el HaNe'eman, which is sort of similar to Emet, sort of keeping, it has to do with faith and truth. Shomer HaBrit, keeping the covenant, VeHaChesed. And notice here how in this context, where Chesed is paired with Brit, with covenant, Alter translates the word differently as faith, covenant and faith. But what's helpful, and that's for those who love God and keep God's commandment, again, into the thousandth generation. But what I want you to see here is the connection between the word Chesed, here translated kindness, faith, and the word Brit, covenant. And I'll explain a little bit more the way that Chesed is very much a covenantal term. So a covenant is a key biblical notion to explain our relationship between God and the Jewish people. So the idea, this was a concept that was taken from other Near Eastern cultures where people would have political covenants, basically treaty agreements. So we use that same idea to describe our relationship with God. We are in a covenantal relationship, a relationship that has certain terms. And as part of that covenant, that special relationship, there are mutual obligations on both parties, both on God toward us and on human beings as well. And notice that it then says, this is for those who love God. And you're, again, likely familiar from the liturgy with this concept of loving God. We have it in a lot of the liturgy, most famously, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you should love your God. And if you've ever wondered, how can it be that someone could be commanded to love, we see from this cluster of words, Brit, Chesed, and here, Ahava, that love in the Bible is very much a covenantal term. It's not so much an emotion, but it has to do with faith. It has to do with being loyal, faithful. So all of those, and we'll kind of come back to that idea, that connection between love and loyalty in a minute. So we see that these are all chesed, like love, like brit. These are all covenantal, cluster of covenantal terms. Another passage I wanted to point out that where we get a sense of just how primal this notion of chesed is to God, the sense of who God is and how God works in the world, is in Psalm 118, which we incorporate in the Hallel liturgy that we sing on the holidays. And here, Hodu Ladonai ki tov, praise God, for God is good, ki leolam chasto, and that repeats, for God's chesed is forever, everlasting. And so I wanted to show you this passage to show how key this quality of chesed is to God. And chesed is something that then, because we are in this covenantal relationship, that God treats us with chesed. So now let's look though, so we have a number of passages where the word chesed is used for the way that God acts in the world, and particularly what God does for human beings. But we also have a number of passages in which chesed describes the relationships between human beings. So this is a passage, one example that I brought. This comes from Genesis 20, one of the passages where Abraham, in this case, Abraham's fearful of the people in the place where they're at, so he tries to pass his wife off as his sister. So, the king Abimelech says, like, what the heck? What are you doing? And then he explains, well, I was afraid, and even though, and I asked her to basically lie and say she was, that my wife was my sister. And then he explains, he said, and it happened when the gods made me a wanderer from my father's house, that I told her, V'amar la zeh chasdech, this is your chesed you can do for me. In every place in which you go, say of me, he's my brother. So you can think about another way you might translate this more colloquially, instead of this is the chesed, is basically do me a favor, right? Do something nice for me that I don't necessarily deserve, but because we are in, and a marriage is another form of a covenantal relationship, because we are in this covenantal relationship, I'm asking you to do this kindness for me, in a sense of do this favor. And then you'll see another good example is from Genesis 49 at the end of, or 47 verse 29, at the end of the book of Genesis, where Jacob, he's about to die, and he calls for his son Joseph, and he says, and I want to point out this one phrase because we're going to see it later, Imna matzati chen be'enecha. If I find favor in your eye, if pray, this is sort of this elevated language, the way in which someone would ask something of someone else. Sim na, again, we have the second use of that word, not please. Put your hand under my thigh. That was a form of asking for, of giving an oath. And then it says, ve'asita imadi, and do for me chesed ve'emet. So notice again, we have these two words, this kind of with the sense of kindness, but also loyalty. And then he asks him, do not bury me in Egypt. So you see this is, again, related to this idea of both kindness, but also loyalty. So you can see from all of these examples and then we'll look at it in a minute in the book of Ruth, but to give you a provisional example here, that chesed then refers to the kind and generous acts that we do for one another, and whether it's God to human beings or human beings to each other, because we are in a relationship with each other. And some of my former students will recognize the examples, or may remember me giving this example. This is that I always give as I try to define chesed. So a pure act of chesed would be when it's the middle of the night, maybe a winter night, it's cold, and your child wakes up and they ask for a glass of water. And not just any glass of water, but a glass of water from the sink downstairs. And even though it's the middle of the night, and even if you were just asleep, you wake up and you go downstairs and you get a cold glass of water and you give it to your kid. That is an act of chesed, a kind and generous act that you do for someone else, not necessarily because you want to, but it's a loving act that you do because you're in a covenantal relationship. That is a good example of chesed, and along with the biblical examples that we've seen. So now with this background to see well, let me just pause to see if there are any questions about the text that we've looked at so far.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. So if anyone has other questions, so now let's look at the book of Ruth, and I've brought some paintings to help us summarize the story of the Ruth, and then we'll intersperse with where we see this word chesed. Because chesed is really the key word, and really shows the way in which chesed operates in the world in an ideal. The word chesed appears 3 times in the book of Ruth. And the narrator, we're going to see the way in which these acts of chesed are not isolated, but one act of chesed leads to another, sort of in the sense of chesed is paying it forward. So we'll watch for how those are connected. So this first painting is from Lionel Picker. Here, and if you happen to one day when our New York campus opens up, there's a beautiful exhibit called Relative Relations, and you can see this exhibit there, or this painting there. So this painting captures a very famous moment in the book of Ruth. So let me give you a little bit of background. Ruth tells the story of an Israelite family, Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 sons, and they're forced to leave Bethlehem because of a famine. And they resettle in neighboring Moab, which is a different country, a different nation state, or just in kind of a different. So they leave Israel and they go to Moab, and there the sons marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah, and while they're there, we see that first Elimelech, the father, dies, and then the 2 sons die. And they're there for 10 years. So it's also noteworthy that they're there for 10 years. There are no children or no grandchildren for Naomi. So now, once Naomi's husband and her 2 sons have died, she decides to go back to Bethlehem. And she urges her daughter-in-laws to go home, to go back to their own house. And basically, she sort of says, like, I don't have a life for you. I don't have any other sons to give you. Go back to your mother's house. And Orpah, who you can see is in the painting, moving away, she kisses Naomi farewell, but Ruth refuses to leave. And in a sense, displaying, without using the word, displaying the book's first act of chesed, Ruth declares, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Wherever you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. So really a very touching example of this concept of chesed, and you can see the element of loyalty that comes out there, both love and kindness, and not leaving Naomi alone, but also the sense of loyalty as well. So this brings us then to the first place, the first textual example where we have the word chesed here. And this is when, just before the scene that we just looked at, where Naomi says to her daughter-in-laws, go back to your mother's house. And then she says, Ya'aseh Adonai imachem chesed ka'asher asitem im hametim ve'imadi. Go back to your mother's house. May Adonai, may God perform chesed to you as each of you have done to the dead, and they're referring to her sons, and with me. And there, and then continuing the hope here that God will grant them a settled place, that each of you in the house of her husband, so that they'll go on and no longer be widows, but they'll remarry. And then she kisses them, and they weep. So this is a first. So now, and we don't know, because the narrative doesn't give us the detail at this point specifically what the act of chesed that the daughter-in-laws did for Naomi. It likely was not necessarily any specific act, but just the love, the kindness, the loyalty that they displayed in all the years that they were her daughter-in-laws, and particularly here how they acted in the face of the death of their husbands. So this is the first time that we see the word chesed in the book of Ruth. So then in chapter 2, and here we have depiction by Adi Ness, an Israeli artist called Ruth and Naomi. And this captures, in a sense, what it was like as Naomi and Ruth went back, two destitute widows who return to Bethlehem. And they go back and they have nothing. So at the beginning of chapter 2, Ruth takes the initiative. Here, she's a foreigner, she's a Moabite. And she says to her mother-in-law, I'm going to go out into the fields and glean. And in this case, she's referring to a practice that we read, that we find in the Torah elsewhere, most notably in Leviticus 19, where we read, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not pick your vineyard bare or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I, Adonai, am your God. So Ruth, the Moabite, knows this teaching, knows this custom. And so she takes the initiative. She says to Naomi, I'm going to go out into the field to gather the gleanings that have been left behind. So this is this painting by Dikla Laor, another Israeli artist, gives a really beautiful picture of sort of what that might have been like for Ruth as she's out in the fields. And the text tells us in chapter 2, as luck would have it, it was where Ruth went was a piece of land belonging to Boaz, who was of Elimelech's family. So in other words, a kinman. So she happens, of all the fields that she could have gone to near Bethlehem, she happens to go to the field of a man named Boaz. And we read, and she's going to meet Boaz. So we're going to see this is the first of 2 Chagall paintings, this one of the meeting of Ruth and Boaz. So chapter 2 introduces us to Boaz. And notice that we don't have the word chesed here, but we have other words that are also related, and it will give us a sense of who Boaz is. So earlier, the chapter begins, before even Ruth goes out, the chapter begins by telling us a piece of narrative information that's going to be relevant for things as they unfold. And that is the fact that Naomi had a kinsman, and he's described here as Ish Gibor Chayil. Sometimes the phrase Gibor Chayil is used in a military context, but here it's sort of a man of worth, and we're going to see that he's a man of stature. He owns the field, and you can see that he's from the same family as Naomi's husband. So Ruth goes into the field, and then in verse 4 it tells us we see, lo and behold, Boaz comes back from Bethlehem. He sees the reaper, and it's always in the Bible, biblical narrative tends to be very terse. And so every word matters, and you want to be, closely read the text. And one thing that you want to be looking for as you're reading a story is, what are the first words a character says? It's very telling to what a character is like. And in this case, the first word that Boaz says is the name of God. Adonai imachem. May Adonai be with you. So that's already, we get from the first thing that we see about Boaz is that he's a God-fearing person. And then his reapers say back to him, Yivarechecha Adonai. May Adonai bless you. So you can see the way in which, in this sort of idyllic world of the book of Ruth, it's a world in which God's presence is manifest through how human beings speak to each other and how they act with one another. And it's a world of kindness and in which people bestow blessings on each other, not just, as we'll see, not just in their words, but also in their acts. So he goes on, and I'll read a little bit more of the intervening narrative here as to what transpires. So after he says, Boaz looks over and he sees that he sees this young woman who catches his eye, and he says, whose girl is that? And then one of the reapers says, she is a Moabite girl who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. So what's interesting to note there is the first thing that that Boaz learns about Ruth is first that she's a foreigner, that she's a Moabite, and secondly that she's related to Naomi, to his kin. And then in verse 7, so again, this is not, I didn't give you the whole section here, she says to him, please let me glean among the sheaves. And he says to her, then in verse 8, listen to me, daughter, which was a term of affection. He says, don't go glean in any field. Don't go elsewhere, but stay close to my girls. Keep your eyes on the field that they are reaping and following them. And I have ordered the men not to molest you or not to bother you. And when you are thirsty, go to the jars and drink some of the water that the men have drawn. So what's interesting about that passage, we get a sense of his generosity, his kindness, the way he takes care of her. That passage also reveals for us the extent to which Ruth was putting herself at risk as this single young woman going into the fields. We only learn sort of afterwards what a vulnerable position she was put in when Boaz makes a point of telling her how to protect herself by staying in his field with his people where he's protecting her. And then the way that Ruth responds is she bows before him in a gesture of recognizing his stature, and she says, why should I matzati chen be'einecha, the phrase that we saw earlier in connection with I have found favor. Why should I have found favor in your eyes that you recognize me, since I'm a foreigner? And Boaz answers hers, and it says that the text lets us know that he already knew what she did for her mother-in-law. And again, the word chesed isn't here, but that is behind the scenes here. And then he bestows a blessing on her. May God basically pay you back. So here again, we're talking about paying forward, pay back your actions. And may your reward be complete from Adonai, God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to shelter. So he asks for God's blessing upon her, not only that's in addition to the protection that he as a human being has provided for her. So that brings us then to the place in the book of Ruth, where the second place in the book of Ruth where we find the word chesed. And this is after the end of the day, Boaz sends her back sort of arms full. So the book of Ruth is also very much about the move from plenty to emptiness. So, Naomi and her family go as a full family. They return to Bethlehem empty. And then it's this return to fullness and to life again. And this is an example of it. She comes back here. She's got all these sheaves that she's collected through the day. And then Naomi asks and she tells her then what happened. And she says, where'd you get all that stuff? And she says, the name of the man who I worked with is Boaz. And Naomi then says, and notice in words that echo Boaz's words, Baruch hu l'Adonai. Blessed is he to Adonai, who has not forsaken chasto, God's kindness with the living and the dead. And you can see the way in that echoes that Naomi's earlier statement about chesed being bestowed both on the living and the dead. So we see from this that Naomi is praising God and recognizing God's chesed being enacted through Boaz's actions. So the way we can see then, the way that human beings, in a sense, are the conduit for God's chesed, this quality of God, kindness, loving kindness, loyalty that we recognize as a quality of God. How does that get enacted in the world? What the book of Ruth is telling us is that gets enacted through the way that human beings treat each other. And Naomi is recognizing that here by here identifying chasto, not as Boaz's chesed, but here the chesed of God. So that brings us then, this is the book gets interesting in the last two chapters. In chapter 3, Naomi takes the initiative And she tells Ruth to go in the middle of the night and to basically lie when Boaz is asleep, to lie at his feet. I'm going to just leave all of the details here of the rest of the story, entice you. It's only 4 chapters, but chapter 3 and chapter 4 you read, and this is the scene in which Boaz wakes up in the middle of the night and sees Ruth, and this is what he says there. So it happens at midnight. He's tossing around. He's on the floor where they've been harvesting the wheat, and he wakes up, and lo and behold, there's a woman lying at his feet. And he says here, how are you? Who are you? And she says, I am Ruth, your servant. May you spread your wings. So notice that here she's repeating the language that he used earlier, talking about God. Again, now that language is being used for human. And she calls him a redeeming kinsman. And this has to do with the way in which if someone was a widow, another male in the family could redeem her and therefore marry her. And Boaz says, blessed. So again, notice the way in which human beings are, through their language and their actions, are bringing God's blessings into the world. Brucha at l'Adonai, blessed are you to Adonai, biti, this term of affection. For you have done better in this latest kindness, this latest act of chesed than the first. Not going after younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. Whatever you say, I will do, for all my people's town know that you are a worthy woman. And the word here, Eshet Chayil, echoes the phrase that was used for Boaz. So kind of here he was a Ish Gibor Chayil. So we have the sense here of sort of them being, this is the text is signaling to us that they're a good match. And we can see then here in his reference to chesed here, and it's a little ambiguous, sort of what is the first act of chesed, and then here what's the second one? Is this the fact that she's in a sense choosing this older man and not a younger man? Does it have to again go back to the way that Ruth treated Naomi, but clearly he recognizes her as someone who acts with chesed. So we've seen then the 3 times that the word chesed operates in the book of Ruth. And that then brings to the conclusion of my teacher, Tamar Eskenazi, and also and I know a number of folks on this call also have studied with Tamar Eskenazi. She's also, I had the privilege of co-editing the Torah Women's Commentary with Tamar Eskenazi. And after we worked on the Torah Women's Commentary, she wrote this, the commentary for the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society Bible series on the book of Ruth. And she writes in that excellent commentary, she writes, no story in the Bible demonstrates more fully than the book of Ruth the extraordinary power of love, channeled as chesed, kindness or generosity, that goes beyond the expected obligations. Megillat Ruth, the Scroll of Ruth, is a book about kindness and audacity, about the kindness that propels people to act audaciously for the sake of others. So that, I think, is another good definition or an explanation of what chesed is all about. This power of love and loyalty, kindness and generosity that we do for one another, and as a result, the way that we bring God's chesed into the world. So I want to, what I wanted you to think about here, and I'm happy to say that we have such a large crowd that we really don't have time for conversation, but I ask you to think about is, what audacious acts of chesed have you performed, witnessed, heard about since the outbreak of the coronavirus? So if you want to put something in the chat, we'll leave a few minutes at the end for what are some of the acts of chesed that you have seen in the last 3 months, as our world has really been turned upside down. But we've also seen, and in so many ways, people treating others with tremendous kindness, generosity, this audacious chesed that we've seen. So while you're thinking about that, we're going to kind of shift gears, and this is at Rabbi Litwack's suggestion. And that is to think about how this concept of chesed plays out in some other religious traditions. And as Rabbi Litwack mentioned, one of a project that I worked on after the 2016 election was a social media project where I got 100 in the days and months after the election. I put together a group of 100 scholars of religion across the country, all different religious traditions, very diverse group, and we sent a letter a day for the first 100 days of the Trump administration to the president, vice president, and members of the 115th Congress. And that project was published as a book, American Values, Religious Voices, available on Amazon, I should add. So I picked out a couple of quotes where I thought were good examples of how this notion of chesed we can see play out in other traditions. So I wanted to start with this letter by Tamar Eskenazi, who I just mentioned, and this will give you a sense of sort of what the letters look like, how they start. The letters are kind of like kids. You're not supposed to have favorites, but this is one of my favorites. This really powerful letter by Tamar Eskenazi. And she writes, in looking at the second paragraph, love in the Bible is about commitment, loyalty, and action rather than feelings. To love others is to take responsibility for their well-being. And I hope you can appreciate now, in a way that you might not have at the beginning of this session, the way in which those words, commitment, loyalty, and action, are all related to this concept of chesed. And that love, like chesed, is this covenantal term, and it means so. And as I mentioned before, love isn't just what we feel, but that all gets. And kindness is not just an emotion, but these are ways in which we act in the world, in these very concrete acts that we perform for other people, acts of kindness, acts of generosity. Another letter that I brought is by Karma Lengshe Tsomo at the University of San Diego. She's a Buddhist scholar, and she begins her letter, as a Buddhist scholar and practitioner, I would like to share some wisdom from my religious heritage with those who have been elected to lead our nation as public servants. Love and compassion are universal values cherished by the people around the world. And if you remember, when we looked at the Exodus passage, the first passage we looked at it was Rahum, compassion, and then Chesed. So then she writes, the Buddha taught these values as antidotes to destructive emotions and behavior. Cultivating inner peace is a powerful way to overcome anger, jealousy, pride, and selfishness. We begin by generating loving kindness toward ourselves and then expend those feelings to others, neighbors, colleagues, enemies, and gradually the whole world, which in light of recent events certainly feels like a lesson that we can all take to heart right now. First, generating that sense of chesed, love, compassion, kindness for ourselves, and then we can radiate that outward into the world. The next quote I brought is from Lisa Bowens, who's a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. And she begins her letter, this monumental moment, you can see she's coming at this as a Christian scholar, this monumental moment of change in this country's history necessitates reflection upon scripture in light of our nation's past, present, and future. At the heart of Christian faith is the belief that the Messiah has come and that we are called to bear witness to Jesus' birth, death, and resurrection in the midst of a suffering world. How do we do this? In Luke's gospel, Jesus announces the two greatest commandments. Love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And you may recognize that coming almost a direct quote from the Ve'ahavta in Deuteronomy. And love your neighbor as yourself. And she's citing both of these as passages from the New Testament from Luke, but these are very much taken originally from quotes from the Hebrew Bible, from the Torah. And she says, by juxtaposing these two commandments, Jesus insists that loving God is intricately linked to loving your neighbors. We display love for God by the treatment of our neighbors, and we can love our neighbors because of our love for God. And this, I picked out this quote because I thought it captures something that we saw in the book of Ruth, which is the way that God's qualities, so this connection between how we treat others and how we treat God, and the way that, in this case, she's talking about here, the love for God gets manifest by how we love our neighbors. And finally, I brought this quote from M. Craig Barnes, also at Princeton Theological Seminary. And this letter is about grace, which we often don't really think about as a necessarily Jewish concept, but I think you can definitely see that this is very much rooted in the same kind of qualities and characteristics that we were talking about. So he writes at the conclusion of his letter, the Christian tradition teaches that only love can dispel the anxieties that plague us. If we try to rationalize our way out of these fears through argument or policy alone, we will never know peace. And no one finds real peace by building walls. The only true balm to our national anxieties is abundant love that stretches to citizens and immigrants, rich and poor and rich, young and old, neighbors and strangers. And then he ends his letter with the following plea: may your administration govern with a wisdom that is guided by love. May grace and peace be ours in abundance as a nation, so that we may be a beacon and a blessing to the world. So I wanted to leave this as our last quote with this idea of the way that our abundant love, and to come back to the biblical term for that, our chesed, can be a way that we can be a balm to our national anxieties, which we are feeling now in 2020. I think, even more than even in 2000. Here, these were written in 2017. As we see, we need this balm, this healing more than ever, and to think about the way that abundant love, or as Tamar Eskenazi wrote about, audacious chesed, can help us provide healing and can help us bring peace and blessing to the world. So with that, I think we have a few minutes left. If there are comments, questions.
Question from earlier. We have lots of comments about, which is great, about kindness and acts of chesed.
Oh, good. So can you share those?
Well, but let's get to the question first, because it goes back to something really earlier. And I want to read it. So hold on, let me get back up here. There it is. What is the significance of using the term chesed in giving a blessing to two non-Israelite women who are not part of the covenant?
Well, I think it gets at part of what the book of Ruth is about, and which is very much kind of a polemic against other books of the Bible that are negative, are against foreigners, and particularly foreign women, and to say that, and not only do we see these foreign women acting with chesed, but Ruth becomes Ruth and Boaz. They end up getting married and having a child, and then that is the line of David. So the book really powerfully says, is really speaking about the embrace of the foreigner. So I think it's, and it also just shows, and I guess that in a sense, thinking about it now, that fits with the message of the text that we looked at in the end, which is that, chesed is not limited to any religion. And really it's, and for the, we need everyone in the world to be acting with chesed. That's, I think, our best hope.
All right, thank you. So let me get some of these audacious acts of chesed out there. People can read them in the chat, but wearing the mask, right, to help protect others. There were any number of comments about shopping for others, for whatever reason couldn't. A close friend of mine took care of her daughter-in-law who had COVID-19 in all sorts of ways, and just let me know her daughter-in-law died, and she'll help with the funeral. Food again. People holding to a more strenuous quarantine for themselves so that they can go and visit their at-risk family members. I have to share this one because of the group. It goes within the part of the group of rabbis that put this together. A neighbor received a fresh baked loaf of bread on their front step. No note, no question, no expectation, just the blessing. Let's see here. A medical resident went into the ICU room of a dying person with an iPad and held it so his family and I could see him and be doing the final prayers with him before he died. Zoom Shiva Minyanim to support our friends and community members around the country, opening up the holy work to a greater number of people who may not ordinarily have been able to come and support their loved ones in time of need. Keeping contact with others and still be able to have Shabbat services, learning opportunities, and feeling that we are still connected, even though virtually. Social distancing for myself for others as well as myself, and remembering to thank those who help us on a daily basis. And then the quote from Pirkei Avot, of course, the world is sustained by three things. Chesed is translated as acts of kindness. Oh, this is a question, sorry. So going off the quote from Pirkei Avot, Chesed is translated as acts of kindness. Do you think that the rabbis meant the same chesed here as in the book of Ruth?
Yeah, I think it's sort of the same thing. As I said at the beginning, it's just hard to, I don't think there's any good English word that encaptures everything about chesed. You'll see it sometimes, kindness, loving kindness, generosity, but no word really can do justice to this idea, which is, and sometimes, again, some people will do kind of hyphenated loving kindness, because it has this connotation of loyalty, these of generosity, of kindness. So I do think it is the same idea. It's just hard to, again, it's one of these biblical words that's hard to translate.
We have another question just popped up. Was there any response to the letters?
Oh, yes. Well, again, this would be another whole topic for a whole other session. So you may have to bring me back for that. So I heard from one chief of staff. So the letters got sent. You can't directly email your senator, your congressperson. So I sent them to everyone's chief of staff and legislative director. And I did hear from, so I sent 100 letters. And I heard from one person in Washington, but we do know that we heard from thousands, well, both the statistics, as we were putting the letters on a website and on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and you can go check our sites out at valuesandvoices.com. But we knew that thousands of people were reading the letters and writing us. And to plug the book a little bit, in the book not only has the 100 letters, but also essays that talk about the feedback, and I tell the story about the one response and the exchange. It's actually, it's very heartening that the one example that took place. And I'll share, the other thing, and both things, the response I got from someone in Washington and this story that I'll tell in a minute, both happened on the same day. And one of the letter writers who lives in Manhattan it was day 24. So we're about a quarter of way into the project. And she was at church that Sunday, and someone came up to her and said, I'm a Democrat living in Manhattan. My brother is a staunch Trump supporter, and he works at Oral Roberts University. And we stopped talking during the campaign. And the letters gave them, he said, we started talking again about the letters, and that reading the letters together gave them a point of connection. So I like to use that as an example of, I think, what study in general, when people come together around sacred texts, around religious texts, is a way that we can bring people together and talk about the things that we share and the ideas and values that unite us. So.
Nice. Do you have time for one more question?
Yep.
Okay. A covenantal obligation is one that is owed based on an agreement. Is chesed something you owe, or is it going above and beyond?
So I definitely would say it goes above and beyond. It's things that we do for one another because we're in a covenantal relationship. So there are a number of biblical texts, particularly in Psalms, where the person says sort of to God, pleads with God, do this act of chesed for me, even though I don't deserve it. But, treat me with kindness and generosity. Be nice to me, save me, heal me. I don't deserve it, but just because we are in this covenantal relationship and because that's a quality that God bestows chesed. So I think it sort of goes, once you're in a relationship, sort of what that means is that if all goes well, that we are driven by love, by loyalty, by our connection to want to do more than just what we have to. And sometimes those are acts that we don't always want to do, but we do it for someone else, sort of, and with that sense of kind of generosity. Yeah. And there's the sense very much in the book of Ruth that one act of chesed leads to another, and that we bring even more chesed into the world and this is the kind of the pay it forward idea, that there's this cascading of chesed. And I think we've seen that in the kind of examples that we've seen in the last 3 months, as to see how people are moved, even at the point of personal risk for themselves, to extend themselves to other people, and the way that inspires you, then all of us, to want to do more, be better people.
Thank you. Before I turn it back to Rabbi Alan Litwack, I want to, first of all, thank you. And he'll do the formal thank yous and wrap up. But I want to thank Rabbi Litwack because this was the concept for this series. The concept for this series was his idea and his inspiration, and I really, on behalf of all of us, want to thank him as well. So, Rabbi Litwack, back to you. Well, you were unmuted. Well, there you go.
Sorry about that. There we go. I got kicked off, and then I got miraculously got back. Well, let me say on behalf of the over 150 people that were on this call, thank you, Rabbi Dr. Weiss. Thank you for teaching us. Thank you for reminding us of what we all need to be thinking about, particularly at this day and time. A beautiful way for us to start this series, and just a reminder to all of you, if you made it onto this call today, all you need to do is use the same as we go through the program. A reminder that next Sunday, then we'll spread them out. It just happened that we didn't want to do it over Father's Day. So we'll do next Sunday. Rabbi Karen Kadar from Chicago, Illinois, wonderful teacher, is going to be doing a session about faith, courage, and wisdom, the language of resilience, which I think is also a great lesson for us today. So thank you to Rabbi Rosenfeld for being our host. Don't worry, over the time you won't have to listen to me all the time. My colleagues and I will share the responsibility. But thank you all for being here. We hope you had a good evening. Again, thank you to Rabbi Dr. Weiss. Right.
My pleasure. Take care, everyone. And do acts of chesed in the world.
Amen.
Amen. Bye, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Bye, everybody.